Callum Brennan stared at the small glass bottle in his trembling hands, knowing it held the only thing standing between him and whatever waited on the other side. 3 days of fever had turned his body into something he barely recognized. The ranch house felt like a furnace even though the morning air outside carried a chill. His shirt clung to his back, soaked through for the 3rd time that night. Every breath came with effort. Every thought moved through mud. The bottle caught the early light coming through the window, and for a moment, he wondered if he'd even have the strength to open it. What he didn't know was that in less than an hour, that bottle would be empty, and it wouldn't be him who drank it. Callum had been alone on this stretch of land for almost a decade, built the house himself, cleared the brush, dug the well. The nearest town sat 3 days' ride to the east, and he preferred it that way. Fewer questions, fewer expectations, fewer people looking at him with that mixture of pity and judgment he'd grown tired of reading in their eyes. The fever started small. A little heat behind his forehead, nothing worth worrying about. By the 2nd day, his hands shook so badly he could barely hold a cup steady. By the 3rd day, he knew. This wasn't passing on its own. He'd made the trip to town 6 weeks back, traded good money for 3 bottles of medicine from the physician who'd set up shop above the general store. Used 2 bottles already for a cough that tried to settle in his chest last month. This was the last one. His last chance. Callum pushed himself up from the bed, legs unsteady beneath him. The room tilted slightly, but he forced himself forward. Had to get water. Had to take the medicine while he still had the clarity to measure it properly. He moved through the small house, one hand on the wall for balance, making his way toward the front door where he kept a bucket of fresh well water on the porch. That's when he saw her. A woman lay crumpled on his porch, halfway between the steps and his front door. Her traditional dress, adorned with intricate beadwork and long fringe, marked her as native to these lands. The morning sun caught the silver of her earrings, the only thing about her that moved as a slight breeze passed through. Callum froze in the doorway, bottle still clutched in his hand. She wasn't moving. He took a step closer, his fever-addled mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Had she collapsed there? How long had she been lying on his porch? Her face was turned away from him, dark hair spread across the weathered wood, but even from where he stood, he could see the unnatural stillness of her body. Then he saw the rise and fall of her back, shallow, irregular, but breathing. Callum knelt beside her, his own weakness making the movement awkward. He reached out, touched her shoulder gently. Her skin burned beneath the fabric of her dress. Hotter than his, hotter than seemed possible. She didn't respond to his touch, didn't open her eyes, didn't make a sound. He looked at the bottle in his hand, then back at the woman dying on his porch. His mind raced through impossible calculations. The medicine in this bottle was measured for 1 person, 1 treatment. There wasn't enough for 2. Callum felt his own fever surging, felt the weakness in his limbs, felt the way his vision blurred at the edges. He knew what his body needed, knew what would happen if he didn't take this medicine soon. But looking at her, at the way her breathing caught and stuttered, at the deathly pallor beneath her sun-touched skin, he knew something else too. She wouldn't last until morning without help, and neither would he. His hand tightened around the bottle, and for the first time in 3 days, the fever wasn't the thing that made him shake. Callum's father used to say that a man's character showed clearest when nobody was watching. Sitting on that porch, bottle in one hand, the other resting on the shoulder of a dying stranger, Callum understood what the old man meant. Nobody would ever know what happened here. The nearest soul was days away. He could take the medicine, and this woman would simply be another person who didn't make it through the harsh realities of frontier life. His hand moved to uncork the bottle. His body screamed for it. Every muscle ached. His vision swam. The fever had progressed to the point where he could feel his thoughts beginning to scatter like frightened birds. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way her breathing hitched, shallow and desperate. Maybe it was seeing someone worse off than himself. Maybe it was just that after 10 years of isolation, of choosing solitude over community, of building walls instead of bridges, he was tired of being the kind of man who could walk away. Callum looked at the woman's face, really looked at her for the first time. She was young, 18, maybe 19 at most. The intricate beadwork on her dress spoke of skill and care. Someone who was valued, who would be missed. Her braided hair had come partially loose, strands sticking to her fevered face. He made his decision before he could think about it too long. Callum lifted her head gently, cradling it in the crook of his arm. She was lighter than he expected. Or maybe he was weaker than he wanted to admit. Her eyes fluttered but didn't open. He uncorked the bottle with his teeth, the bitter smell of the medicine sharp in the morning air. Getting her to swallow was harder. Most of it ran down her chin at first. He tried again, tilting her head back slightly, speaking to her even though she couldn't hear him. "Come on, you have to swallow. Come on." Some instinct in her responded. Her throat worked. Once. Twice. The medicine went down. Callum gave her the entire bottle, every drop. The part of his mind still capable of basic arithmetic knew he was signing his own death warrant. That medicine was carefully measured. The physician had been clear about dosage. 1 bottle. 1 person. Taken over the course of a day. He'd just given it all to someone who might not even survive to see sunset. When the bottle was empty, he set it down on the porch beside them and carefully lowered her head back to the wooden boards. His hands shook worse now. Whether from the fever or from what he'd just done, he couldn't tell. Callum tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. He sat down hard, back against the porch post, the woman lying a few feet away. The sun was climbing higher. It would be a hot day. He could already feel it. His eyes grew heavy. The fever wrapped around him like a thick blanket, pulling him down into a darkness that felt almost welcoming. His last conscious thought was wondering if they'd find their bodies here. 2 strangers who died on the same porch for different reasons. But as his eyes closed, he didn't see the woman's fingers twitch. Didn't see her chest rise with a slightly deeper breath. Didn't see the first sign that the medicine was beginning to work. Didn't see her eyes open. Just a sliver before his world went black. Ayita's first conscious thought was pain. It filled every corner of her body, a deep ache that seemed to come from her bones themselves. Her second thought was confusion. The wooden boards beneath her cheek were wrong, unfamiliar. Not the smooth leather of her family's dwelling, not the woven mats she'd known her entire life. She forced her eyes open. The midday sun so bright it felt like needles. She was on a porch, a stranger's porch. The house behind her was simple, weathered wood with a fresh coat of white paint, the kind settlers built when they claimed land that didn't belong to them. Ida tried to piece together how she'd gotten here. She remembered the fever starting yesterday morning, remembered her father, Tahatan, making her drink bitter tea that did nothing to break the heat consuming her from within. Remembered walking, desperate for cool water, following the creek bed that led away from their camp. After that, everything became fragments, collapsing. The wooden steps beneath her hands, the blessed shade of a porch roof. She turned her head, the movement sending waves of dizziness through her, and saw him. A man slumped against the porch post, head tilted at an unnatural angle, shirt dark with sweat. His breathing was loud in the quiet afternoon. Each inhale a ragged struggle. Even from several feet away, she could see the violent tremor running through his limbs. He was burning up, worse than she had been. Ayita's eyes traveled to the empty glass bottle lying on its side between them. She recognized the shape. Trade medicine, the kind the traveling physicians sold in the settlements. Her people rarely trusted such things, preferring their own remedies, but she'd seen these bottles before. Understanding came slowly, through the fog still clouding her mind. She touched her own forehead, still warm, but nothing like before. The fever that had been consuming her had broken, or at least retreated to something manageable. This man, this stranger, had given her his medicine. All of it, judging by the empty bottle. Ayita pushed herself to sitting, her body protesting every movement. The beadwork on her dress caught the light, the careful patterns her mother had taught her to make, patterns that told stories, that marked her family, that connected her to something older than the settlements spreading across the land. She looked at the man again. He needed help, needed it desperately, but she was alone here, miles from her father's camp, barely able to sit upright herself. The nearest settlement was days away. Even if she could ride, she didn't see a horse. Just an empty corral beside the house, the fence post standing silent sentinel. Her father would know what to do. Tahatan had knowledge passed down through generations, plants and roots and treatments the settlers had never heard of. But he was too far away. By the time she could make it back to camp, this man would be dead. Ayita touched the empty bottle again, turned it over in her hands. Why had he done it? She was nobody to him. A stranger. Her people and his had never been allies. The history between them was written in broken treaties and burned villages, and suspicion that ran deep as roots. Yet he'd saved her life. She struggled to her feet. had to grab the porch railing to keep from falling. Her legs felt like water, but she forced them to hold her weight. She moved to where the man sat, crouched beside him. His face was slack with unconsciousness, skin flushed with dangerous heat. She placed her hand on his forehead and pulled it back immediately. He was burning alive from the inside. Aita knew enough about fever to understand what she was seeing. He had hours at most, maybe less. Her mind raced through what she knew, what her father had taught her, what plants grew in this region, what treatments were possible with what she could find nearby. It wasn't much, wasn't nearly enough, but maybe, just maybe, there was one option left. She would have to leave him, would have to ride through the afternoon heat, through terrain that would test her even at full strength, would have to pray that her father hadn't moved camp, would have to pray that she could find her way back before this stranger's fever took what remained of his life. Aita looked at the man one last time, at the face of someone who'd chosen her life over his own, and made her decision. Aita moved through the stranger's property with purpose she didn't quite feel. Every step required concentration. Her body wanted to collapse back onto that porch, wanted to surrender to the weakness still coursing through her veins. But the image of the man's fever-ravaged face kept her moving. She found the barn behind the house, a modest structure that had seen better years. The door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with heat and the smell of old hay. Her eyes adjusted to the dimness, searching for what she hoped would be there. A single horse stood in the back stall, a gray mare with intelligent eyes that tracked Aita's movements. The animal looked well-fed, healthy. Beside the stall hung a simple saddle and bridle, leather cracked, but serviceable. Aita approached slowly, hand extended. The mare snorted but didn't shy away. Good. She couldn't afford to waste time chasing a skittish animal. Her hands trembled as she lifted the saddle. It was heavier than she remembered things being. The fever had stolen more of her strength than she wanted to admit. Getting the saddle onto the mare took 3 attempts. By the third, Aita's arms burned and her vision swam. She leaned against the stall wall, breathing hard, forcing her body to cooperate. The horse waited patiently, as if sensing the desperation of the moment. When she finally led the mare out into the afternoon sun, Aita had to stop and orient herself. The creek bed she'd followed earlier should run north from here, follow it upstream, and she'd find familiar markers. From there, she could navigate to where her father's group had camped 3 days ago. If they'd moved, she'd have to track them, time she didn't have. Mounting the horse required using a fence post for leverage. Even then, she nearly fell twice before managing to swing her leg over. Once seated, she allowed herself 10 seconds to catch her breath, then turned the mare toward the creek. The ride became a blur of endurance. The sun burned overhead, and Aita had left without water or supplies. Her dress, still damp with the sweat of her fever, offered little protection. The mare moved at a steady pace, but every jolt sent waves of nausea through Aita's stomach. She recognized the twisted cottonwood first, its trunk split by lightning years ago, then the red rocks jutting from the hillside like broken teeth. Her people had camped near here countless times, moving with the seasons, following water and game. The landmarks were as familiar as her own face. The sun had moved considerably by the time she spotted the thin column of smoke rising in the distance. Her heart lurched with relief so intense it was almost painful. They were still there. Her father was still there. Aita urged the mare faster, though the animal was already exhausted. They crested a low rise, and she could see the camp spread below. 4 dwellings arranged in a loose circle, horses grazing nearby, a small fire burning at the center. Home. She recognized her father immediately. Tahatan stood near the fire, speaking with 2 other men. Even from this distance, she could see the way he held himself, the quiet authority that came not from volume but from respect earned over decades. Aita tried to call out, but her voice came as barely a whisper. She urged the mare down the slope, and movement caught her father's eye. He turned, saw her, and the conversation stopped mid-sentence. She watched his expression change as she drew closer, saw him register her weakened state, her borrowed horse, the desperation written across her features. He was moving toward her before she reached the camp's edge. Aita slid from the saddle more than dismounted, her father's hands catching her before her legs gave out entirely. "Daughter," his voice was steady, but she heard the concern beneath it. "You should not be traveling. The fever." "Father." She gripped his arms, forced herself to meet his eyes. "A man is dying. He saved my life, gave me his only medicine. I need your help. Tahatan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A settler? Yes. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of history that Aida didn't fully understand. Finally, her father spoke. Show me where. Tahatan moved with efficiency born from years of healing. He disappeared into his dwelling and emerged moments later with a leather satchel, its surface worn smooth from use. Inside, Aida knew, were bundles of dried plants, roots harvested at specific times, bark stripped from trees that grew only in certain places, knowledge passed down through generations, refined through observation and experience. You cannot ride again so soon, he said, securing the satchel to his horse. You will rest here. Father, you need to recover. His tone left no room for argument. I will find this man. You have done your part. Aida wanted to protest, but her body was already betraying her. The ride from the settler's property had cost her the last of her reserves. Her father was right. Another journey would accomplish nothing except making her burden instead of help. She described the location carefully. The creek bed, the twisted cottonwood, the white house with the covered porch. Tahatan listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing of what he thought about this unprecedented mission. How long ago did you leave him? He asked when she finished. Aida tried to calculate. The sun's position when she'd left, its position now. 3 hours, maybe 4. Something flickered across her father's face. Too quick to read. He mounted his horse without another word, turned it toward the direction Aida had come from, and rode out at a pace that spoke of urgency without panic. Years of experience had taught him how to measure time against the progression of fever, how to gauge what could be saved and what was already lost. The ride back felt longer than it had that morning. Tahatan knew these lands like the lines on his own palms, but sunset was approaching. He pushed his horse faster than he normally would, driven by something he didn't want to examine too closely. His daughter had asked for his help. That should have been reason enough. But there was something else in the story she'd told. A settler who'd given his only medicine to a stranger, who'd chosen certain death over the possibility of survival. Such actions were rare in any man. Rarer still between peoples who'd spent generations as adversaries. Tahatan spotted the house as the sun touched the horizon. He'd been this way before, years ago, but had never approached the dwelling. Settler territories were best avoided. Less contact meant fewer conflicts. He dismounted at the porch steps, tying his horse to the railing. The man still slumped against the post where Aida had left him, but his position had shifted slightly. His head had rolled to one side, and the violent tremor she'd described had progressed to occasional convulsions that shook his entire frame. Tahatan climbed the steps and knelt beside the stranger. He placed his hand on the man's forehead first, a gesture that transcended cultural boundaries. The heat was profound, the kind that cooked the brain. That left permanent damage even in those lucky enough to survive. He checked the pulse at the man's neck. Rapid, thready, the body fighting a battle it was losing. Tahatan opened his satchel and began working with practiced precision. First, he needed to bring down the fever before it caused irreversible harm. He crushed willow bark between his fingers, mixed it with water from his pouch, creating a paste. Getting it past the man's lips required patience. Most ran down his chin, but some made it through. Next came feverfew, a plant the settlers called by different names, but whose properties were identical regardless of language. He prepared a compress, soaking strips of cloth in an infusion he'd made that morning for a different patient. The timing was fortunate. Sometimes the materials you needed were simply at hand. He worked through the evening, monitoring the stranger's breathing, adjusting treatments as the fever's pattern revealed itself. This wasn't magic. This wasn't mysticism. This was observation, experience, and knowledge accumulated through generations of healers who'd learned to read the body's signals, to understand what plants did what, to know that recovery was never guaranteed, but could sometimes be coaxed forward through careful intervention. As night fell completely, Tahatan settled beside the man, prepared to watch through the dark hours, the most dangerous time, when fevers either broke or claimed their victims. He thought of his daughter's face when she'd asked for help, thought of the empty medicine bottle still lying on the porch, thought of what it meant that a stranger had saved her life, and he waited to see if he could return the favor. The hours between midnight and dawn were when fever claimed most of its victims. Tahatan had seen it countless times. The body, exhausted from fighting, simply gave up when darkness was deepest. He'd learned not to leave patients alone during those hours, learned that sometimes presence itself was medicine. Callum's convulsions had worsened as the night wore on. His body arched against the wooden boards, muscles locking in spasms that looked painful even to witness. Tahatan had moved him inside, into the small bedroom, onto a proper bed where he could work more easily. The man's clothes were soaked through. Tahatan had changed them twice already, replacing wet fabric with dry, trying to manage the dangerous cycle of heat and chills. The willow bark was helping, but slowly, too slowly. Tahatan prepared another treatment, this one using yarrow leaves he'd harvested weeks ago specifically for fever cases. He crushed them carefully, mixing them with rendered fat to create a paste he could rub onto the man's chest and throat. The plant helped open airways, made breathing easier. Small improvements, but they accumulated. Every hour he checked the pulse at the neck, the wrist, behind the knee. Each location told him something different about how the heart was handling the strain. The rhythm had been erratic earlier, but was starting to settle into something more regular. Not healthy yet, but moving in the right direction. Tahatan had brought water from the well, cool and clean. He used cloth strips to create compresses for the forehead, the back of the neck, the insides of the wrists, places where blood ran close to the surface, where cooling had the most impact. He changed these compresses every few minutes, working in a rhythm that was almost meditative. Around the third hour after midnight, something changed. The convulsions stopped. Callum's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, deepened slightly. The violent heat pouring off his skin began to moderate, not gone, not even close to normal, but less apocalyptic. Tahatan allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. He'd seen fevers turn at this hour before, seen the moment when the body decided to fight instead of surrender. It wasn't guaranteed. The fever could resurge. But this was the first real sign that the stranger might survive. He prepared a broth using dried meat and herbs from his satchel, something nutrient-dense that could be gotten down in small amounts. The man had been unconscious for hours now, burning through whatever reserves his body had left. If he woke, he'd need sustenance immediately. Tahatan found himself studying the stranger's face in the lamplight. Weathered skin spoke of years spent outdoors. The calluses on his hands told of physical labor. This was a working man, someone who'd built something here in isolation. The house was well maintained despite its simplicity. The barn, though small, was sturdy. This man took care of what was his, and he'd given away his last chance at survival for a stranger. Tahatan had lived through enough years to know how rare that was. Most people talked about sacrifice, about helping others. Few actually did it when the cost was their own life. Yet this settler, who had every reason to see Aida as an enemy, had made that choice without hesitation. The implications of that choice sat heavy in Tahatan's mind. His people and the settlers had existed in a state of uneasy distance for years, sometimes erupting into violence, more often simply avoiding each other, building walls of mistrust that seemed permanent. But walls could be torn down, bridges could be built. Sometimes it only took one person willing to make the first move. As dawn approached, the first gray light creeping through the window, Callum's eyes moved beneath their lids, the first sign of returning consciousness. His breathing changed again, becoming more purposeful, less automatic. Tahatan leaned forward, prepared for the moment when awareness would return, prepared to explain why a native healer was sitting beside a settler's bed, prepared to tell this man that the life he'd saved had saved him in return. The stranger's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, struggling to make sense of what they were seeing. When they finally locked onto Tahatan's face, sitting there in the early morning light beside his bed, Tahatan saw the confusion, saw the moment of fear, then saw something else. Recognition, perhaps, or simply acceptance that whatever was happening, he was too weak to resist it. Tahatan spoke first, his voice quiet in the dawn stillness. "Your fever has broken. You will live." Callum's throat felt like he'd swallowed sand. He tried to speak, but only managed a rough sound that barely qualified as human. The man beside his bed reached for something beyond Callum's field of vision, then brought a cup to his lips. Water, cool and clean. Callum drank greedily, some spilling down his chin. "Slowly," the man said. His accent was different from what Callum was used to, but the English was clear. "Too fast and you will be sick." Callum forced himself to slow down, taking small sips even though everything in him wanted to drain the cup. His mind was still catching up, still trying to piece together what had happened. He remembered the woman on his porch, remembered the fever consuming him, remembered giving her the medicine. After that, nothing. A void of darkness that could have lasted hours or days. How long? His voice came out as barely a whisper. Since yesterday afternoon when I found you. The man set the cup aside, his movements economical and practiced. The fever nearly took you. It was close. Callum's eyes traced the room slowly. His bedroom. Someone had cleaned it. The window was open, letting in morning air. Strips of cloth lay in a basin beside the bed. His clothes had been changed. This stranger had spent the night keeping him alive. The woman, Callum managed. On the porch. Is she? My daughter, Aida. Something that might have been approval crossed the man's face. She lives because of what you did. The medicine you gave her broke the fever. She rode to find me. The pieces started fitting together. The woman had survived, had somehow found the strength to seek help, had brought this man back to save him. The symmetry of it would have been poetic if Callum had energy for poetry. I'm Tahatan, the man gestured to himself. I am a healer among my people. Callum. It took effort to get his own name out. Callum Brennan. They sat in silence for a moment, an unlikely pair brought together by fever and circumstance. Callum studied the man more carefully now, older than he'd first appeared, 50, maybe more. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes were sharp, hands that moved with certainty. This was someone who'd spent a lifetime learning to read bodies, to understand sickness, to coax people back from the edge. Why? Callum asked finally. Your people and mine. We're not exactly friends. Tahatan considered the question, his expression thoughtful. My daughter asked for my help. That would have been reason enough. But she told me what you did, how you gave her your only medicine knowing what it would cost you. He paused. Such actions are rare. They deserve to be answered in kind. Callum closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him despite having just woken. I didn't do it expecting anything back. I know. That is why I came. The simple truth of that statement hung in the air between them. Callum had saved Aida because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected reward or recognition. And Tahatan had saved Callum for the same reason. Two acts of humanity that transcended the barriers people built between themselves. The broth is ready when you can eat, Tahatan said, rising from his seat beside the bed. Your body needs nutrients. The fever took much from you. Wait! Callum opened his eyes again. How long until I can move around properly? Days. Maybe a week. The fever damaged your strength. Recovery takes time. Tahatan moved toward the door, then paused. There is no rush. I will stay until you are steady enough to manage alone. You don't have to. I know. Tahatan's expression was unreadable. But I will. After he left, Callum lay staring at the ceiling, processing everything. He'd lived alone for a decade by choice, had convinced himself that isolation was preferable to the complications of community, had built walls because walls felt safer than bridges. Then a woman had collapsed on his porch, and everything changed. He thought about the empty medicine bottle, about the moment he'd made his choice, about how close he'd come to dying on that porch beside a stranger, about waking to find that stranger's father sitting beside his bed, having spent the night keeping him alive. Maybe walls weren't always the answer. Maybe sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was tear them down. Outside, the sun climbed higher into a clear sky. Callum's fever was broken. His body would recover with time. But something else had broken too. Something that had kept him isolated and alone for too long. And in its place, something new was beginning to grow. Something that felt like possibility, like connection, like the beginning of a bridge that had started with one impossible choice on a desperate morning. 5 days passed before Callum could stand without his legs threatening to give out. 5 days of Tahatan bringing broth that gradually became solid food, of treatments that reduced inflammation, of slow walks from the bed to the chair and back again. Progress measured in inches, not miles. On the morning of the 6th day, Callum made it to the porch under his own power. Tahatan followed at a careful distance, ready to catch him if necessary, but Callum's legs held. He lowered himself into the chair where he used to sit alone every evening, watching the sun set over land he'd claimed as his own. The view looked different now, or maybe he was seeing it differently. He heard the horse before he saw it. Tahatan heard it too, his posture shifting slightly. A gray mare crested the small rise, and Callum recognized her immediately. His own horse, the one Aida must have taken. The woman riding her was the same person he'd found collapsed on his porch, yet completely transformed. No longer fever-pale and unconscious. Now she sat upright, her traditional dress bright in the morning sun, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime on horseback. Aida dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, her eyes finding her father first, then settling on Callum. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Just three people acknowledging the weight of what had passed between them. "You look better," Aida said finally. Her English was accented but clear, like her father's. "Then half dead on a porch?" Callum managed a weak smile. "That's not a high standard." She didn't smile back, but something softened in her expression. She climbed the porch steps slowly, deliberately, until she stood directly in front of him. Then, carefully, she reached into a pouch at her waist and pulled out the empty medicine bottle, the one Callum had given her, the one that had saved her life and nearly cost him his. She held it out to him. "My father says you knew what this choice meant, that you made it anyway." Callum took the bottle, turned it over in his hands. It felt lighter than he remembered. "I didn't really think about it. Just saw someone who needed help more than I did. That is what makes it matter." Aida glanced at her father, something passing between them that Callum couldn't quite read. "We brought you something. A trade of sorts." Tahatan stepped forward, producing a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. He placed it in Callum's hands. Inside were packets of dried plants, carefully labeled in a script Callum didn't recognize. But Tahatan explained each one, what it treated, how to prepare it, when to use it. "This land can be harsh," Tahatan said. "Fever will come again. Injuries happen. These will help. And if they are not enough, you know where to find me now." The implications of that statement weren't lost on Callum. An invitation, an open door, a bridge built from two acts of compassion that had somehow survived the weight of history and suspicion. "I don't know what to say," Callum admitted. "Say you will use them." Aida's voice was firm. "Say you will not wait until you are dying to ask for help. Say you will remember that not all strangers are enemies," Tahatan added quietly. Callum looked at the bundle in his hands, at the father and daughter who'd saved his life, at the bridge they'd built together from nothing but impossible choices and stubborn hope. He'd spent 10 years believing that isolation was safety, that walls protected better than bridges. He'd been wrong. "I'll remember," he said, and meant it. Aida nodded once, satisfied. She mounted her horse again, and Tahatan did the same. But before they rode away, Callum called out, "The gray mare. She's yours now. Seems only fair." Aida looked at the horse, then back at him. "A gift?" "A trade," Callum corrected, "for the medicine you've given me, and for teaching me that some walls need to come down." This time, Aida did smile. Small, but genuine. She turned the gray mare alongside her father's mount, and together they rode toward the horizon, where the sun was climbing higher. Callum watched them go, the bundle of medicine still warm in his hands, and realized something had changed permanently, not just in him, in the space between peoples who'd spent too long seeing each other as other. One choice on a desperate morning had started it, but what happened next would be up to all of them. If you enjoyed this story of sacrifice and unexpected connections in the wild frontier, click the video on your screen to watch another compelling tale from the untamed territories. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story about courage, redemption, and the bridges we build across impossible distances. The safe sat in the middle of the street like a monument to arrogance. Ornate brass fittings caught the midday light, while curious townspeople formed a loose circle around it. Magnus Hartwell stood beside his prize with one hand resting on its iron surface, a thin cigar balanced between his fingers. Across from him, a man in worn rancher's clothes studied the safe with an expression nobody could quite read. But what Magnus didn't know was that some men carry their past in their hands, not their words. And what looked like entertainment to the crowd was about to become the most expensive mistake Magnus Hartwell would ever make. Because the man he chose to humiliate had spent 15 years of his life doing something Magnus never bothered to ask about. And when Silas Crow placed his calloused palm against that safe's cold metal, he felt something Magnus couldn't see: recognition. Silas had arrived in town 3 hours earlier, with nothing but a wagon carrying the last salvageable pieces from his failing ranch. Fence posts, tools, a saddle that had seen better decades. He'd driven the wagon down the main street with his jaw tight, knowing every eye that landed on him saw the same thing, another man losing his grip on the life he'd built. The town had a name, though Silas had stopped caring about names of places. They all felt the same when you were drowning. Wooden buildings with false fronts, a bank that controlled more lives than it served, a saloon where men with too much time spent too much money, and everywhere the shadow of Magnus Hartwell's influence. Silas had planned to sell his goods quickly, take whatever pittance he could get, return to his land and figure out how to survive another season. Simple, quiet, anonymous. But Magnus Hartwell didn't believe in letting anyone pass through quietly. The confrontation started at the bank. Silas had walked in hoping to negotiate an extension on his loan. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, barely looked at him. Mr. Hartwell doesn't extend credit to failing enterprises. Silas had expected that. He'd already prepared himself for rejection. What he hadn't expected was Magnus himself emerging from a back office, expensive suit immaculate, gold watch chain gleaming across his vest. "Crow, isn't it?" Magnus had said, not waiting for an answer. "I've been watching your land lose value for 3 years now. At some point, a man has to accept reality." Silas had kept his voice level. "I'm not here to accept anything. I'm here to discuss terms." Magnus had smiled then, not with warmth, with the particular cruelty of someone who enjoyed watching others squirm. Discussion implies negotiation between equals. Magnus had circled Silas slowly, appraising him like livestock. "What I see is a man with nothing trying to pretend he deserves something." The clerk had shifted uncomfortably. 2 other customers pretended not to listen while absorbing every word. "I have goods to sell," Silas had said. "Good tools, materials, worth more than what I owe. To you, perhaps." Magnus had paused, cigar smoke curling around his words. "Tell you what, Crow, I'm feeling generous today. Come outside. Let's give the town something to talk about." And that's how Silas ended up standing in the street, staring at an ornate safe that Magnus's men had hauled from the bank specifically for this moment. The safe was beautiful in its way scrollwork etched into the metal dual combination locks, hinges thick as a man's wrist. It looked old but maintained, the kind of safe that held more than money. It held reputation. Magnus raised his voice so the growing crowd could hear. "Inside this safe is 500 in gold, more than enough to clear your debt and keep your pathetic ranch running another year." Silas watched Magnus's hand pat the safe's top panel possessively. "Open it," Magnus continued, "and the gold is yours. Fail, and you sign over your land to me right now. Everything you have left." The crowd murmured. Someone laughed. A woman whispered something to her companion. Silas looked at the safe, then at Magnus's confident smirk, then back at the safe. His throat felt dry. His hands, rough from years of ranching, flexed at his sides. "You expect me to crack a safe in the middle of the street? I expect you to try." Magnus's smile widened. "Or, admit you're exactly what I said you were, nothing." The words hit like they were meant to. Silas felt his jaw tighten, felt the weight of every watching eye, felt the familiar burn of humiliation that came with being poor in a world run by men like Magnus. But underneath that burn, something else flickered, something cold and calculating. Something from a life Silas had buried under 15 years of dirt and cattle and failed harvests. He looked at the safe again, really looked at it this time. Noted the manufacturer's mark barely visible on the lower left corner. Noted the specific pattern of the combination locks. Noted the way the metal had worn smooth in certain places from decades of hands opening and closing it the same way. "One attempt?" Silas asked quietly. "One attempt." Magnus tapped ash from his cigar onto the dirt. "And when you fail, you walk to my office and sign the papers like a man." Silas felt something shift in his chest. Not hope, he'd stopped trusting hope years ago, but recognition, certainty, the kind of knowledge that doesn't fade no matter how hard you try to forget it. "All right," Silas said. "I'll open your safe." The crowd noise swelled. Magnus's smile turned triumphant. He gestured grandly toward the safe like a showman presenting his main attraction. "Be my guest, Mr. Crow. Show us what a desperate man can accomplish." Silas stepped forward, knelt beside the safe, placed both palms flat against its cool surface. And somewhere in the back of his mind, muscle memory that had been sleeping for 15 years began to wake up. The metal felt familiar under Silas's palms. Too familiar. He traced the edges of the combination locks with his fingertips, feeling the microscopic ridges that most people would never notice. The crowd pressed closer, forming a tighter circle. Boots shuffled in the dirt. Whispers rippled through the assembled townspeople like wind through dry grass. Magnus stepped forward, positioning himself where everyone could see his face. "Take your time. Crow, we've got all afternoon to watch you embarrass yourself." Someone in the crowd laughed. Others joined in. The sound pressed against Silas's back like physical weight, but Silas wasn't listening anymore. His fingers had found what they were looking for, the slight wear pattern on the first combination dial. Years of someone's thumb turning it the same direction, the same speed, the same number of rotations. The metal remembered even when people forgot. He closed his eyes, let his hands do what his mind had been trying to forget for 15 years. "What's he doing?" a woman asked. "Praying, probably," another voice answered. More laughter. Magnus's voice cut through the noise. "If you're waiting for divine intervention, I should warn you, I own the church too." The crowd loved that. Even the clerk from the bank, standing near the back, allowed himself a thin smile. Silas opened his eyes, looked up at Magnus. "This safe, where'd you get it?" Magnus's expression flickered with surprise, before settling back into condescension. "That's none of your concern. Humor me. Why would I do that?" "Because," Silas said quietly, "in about 2 minutes you're going to wish you'd been honest about what's inside." The confidence in Silas's voice did something to the crowd. The laughter died. People shifted their weight. Magnus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It belonged to a railroad company," Magnus said slowly. "Bought it at auction 5 years ago. Why?" "Railroad company." Silas turned back to the safe, nodding to himself. "That explains the modifications." "What modifications?" But Silas was already working. His right hand found the first dial, started turning it with a precision that didn't match his rough appearance. Clockwise. Stop. Counterclockwise. Stop. The movements were deliberate but not hesitant. Not the fumbling of a desperate man guessing. Something else entirely. "Hold on," someone in the crowd said. "He knows what he's doing." "Nobody knows how to open that safe," Magnus said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I had 3 locksmiths examine it. They said it would take hours with proper tools." Silas's fingers paused on the second dial. "They weren't railroad locksmiths." The words hung in the air. Magnus stared at the back of Silas's head. The clerk's mouth opened slightly. A woman near the front whispered something urgent to her husband. "What did you say?" Magnus asked. Silas didn't answer. He was counting something in his head. Numbers that came from muscle memory older than his ranching life, older than his failures, from a time when his hands had been steady and his future had looked different than dirt and cattle and debt. The second dial clicked. Not loud, but in the sudden silence of the street, everyone heard it. "Wait," Magnus said. Silas moved to the third dial. This one was trickier. The railroad company had added it later, probably after some theft they'd been trying to prevent, but they'd used a standard modification, one that Silas had seen a dozen times before he'd ever touched a fence post or branded a calf. His fingers moved. The dial turned. Another click. Magnus took a step forward. "You need to stop." "Why?" Silas didn't look up. "Worried about something?" "You can't possibly." The fourth dial surrendered like the others. 4 clicks total. Silas's hands moved to the lever. The crowd was completely silent now. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Crow." Magnus's voice had changed. The smugness was gone. In its place was something sharper. "We should discuss this privately." Silas's fingers wrapped around the lever. "You said open the safe. I'm opening the safe. I'll pay you." The words came out fast. "Whatever you owe, double it. Just step away from." Silas pulled the lever. The safe door swung open with a heavy final sound, like a judge's gavel, like a door slamming shut on a man's arrogance, like the moment when everything you thought you knew reveals itself to be wrong. Magnus went pale. The crowd surged forward, necks craning to see inside, and what they saw made several people gasp, made others start talking all at once, made the clerk from the bank take 3 fast steps backward. Because the safe didn't contain 500 in gold, it contained closer to 5,000. And underneath the gold, visible to everyone now, were documents, deeds, papers with names on them, properties that Magnus had claimed were bought legitimately, but had question marks beside the purchase dates. Silas stood up slowly, dusted off his knees, looked at Magnus with an expression that held no triumph, just tired recognition of what comes after lies catch up to the people who tell them. "You want to renegotiate?" Silas asked quietly. Magnus's mouth opened, closed, opened again, and the crowd, which had been laughing at Silas 10 minutes ago, was now staring at Magnus Hartwell like they were seeing him for the first time. Magnus recovered faster than Silas expected. The color returned to his face in patches, and his eyes narrowed into something calculating. He looked at the open safe, then at the crowd, then back at Silas. When he spoke, his voice carried that forced casualness that men use when they're scrambling for control. Well, I underestimated you. Crow, that's my mistake. The crowd was still murmuring. A tall man in the back pointed at the papers visible beneath the gold. Those look like the Henderson deeds. The ones that's private business. Magnus cut him off sharply. Then softer, turning back to Silas with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A deal's a deal. The gold is yours. Silas looked at the open safe, at the stacks of gold coins gleaming in the afternoon light. At the papers underneath that told stories Magnus clearly didn't want told. 5,000 instead of 500. Documents instead of empty space. You lied about how much was in there, Silas said. I rounded down. Magnus gestured dismissively. Does it matter? You won. But Silas was watching Magnus's hands, the way they'd moved to his coat pocket, the way his eyes kept flicking toward the bank entrance where two men stood. Men who hadn't been there before. Men whose postures suggested they were more than clerks. The crowd sensed it too. The energy shifted. People who'd pressed forward to see the gold now took half steps back, creating space for whatever was about to happen. Take the gold, Magnus said. Clear your debt. We'll call it even. And the papers? Stay in the safe. Magnus's voice hardened. Where they belong. Silas knelt again. Reached past the gold. His fingers touched the edge of a deed. The crowd went very quiet. Magnus's hand stayed in his coat pocket. Don't, Magnus said. Why? Silas pulled the first paper out slowly. What are you hiding? The deed was for Henderson property, purchased 6 months ago, but the signature looked wrong, the date looked wrong, and the witness line was blank where it should have been notarized. That's forgery, someone in the crowd said. Magnus's face turned red. That's slander. But Silas was already reaching for another paper, and another. Each one told a similar story. Properties bought for far less than their value. Signatures that looked forced or traced. Dates that didn't match public records. A pattern of acquisition that relied on people not asking questions, and officials not looking too close. You've been stealing land, Silas said quietly. It wasn't a question. I've been buying land legally. Magnus's voice rose. And unless you want trouble, you'll put those papers back and take your gold and leave. The two men from the bank stepped into the street. One of them had his hand on something under his coat. The crowd pulled back further. A woman grabbed her child and started walking away quickly. Silas stood up with the papers in his hand, faced Magnus directly. You made this public. You put your safe in the middle of the street. You challenged me in front of everyone. And you won. So take your prize and go. The prize was opening the safe. I opened it. Silas held up the papers. Everything in it belongs to me now. That was the deal. Magnus's jaw clenched. The two men from the bank moved closer. The street felt smaller suddenly, more dangerous. You're making a mistake, Magnus said. No. Silas's voice stayed level. You made the mistake. You assumed I was just another desperate rancher you could humiliate. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't wonder why my hands knew that safe better than your locksmiths. Who are you? The question came from someone in the crowd, but it was the question everyone was thinking. Silas looked at the papers in his hand, at the safe still sitting open in the street, at Magnus's face turning from red to something darker and more volatile. Then he looked at his own rough hands, hands that had spent 15 years trying to forget what they once knew, what they'd been trained to do before everything fell apart, before he'd run from a different life and buried himself in ranching and debt and anonymity. I used to work for the railroad, Silas said finally. Security division. Spent 12 years traveling between territories, installing safes, training locksmiths, investigating theft. The crowd absorbed this. Magnus's expression shifted from anger to something more complex, calculation mixed with growing concern. That was a long time ago, Silas continued. I left that life, tried to build something different, something quiet. Why'd you leave? The tall man asked. Silas didn't answer. The silence stretched. Magnus used it. So you're a thief. Magnus's voice carried across the street. Former railroad security who knows how to crack safes. And now you're stealing my property in broad daylight. The words did what they were meant to do. Planted doubt. Made people look at Silas differently. The two men from the bank moved closer still. Silas felt the situation shifting. Felt the weight of Magnus's influence pressing down. Felt the familiar sensation of being trapped between what was right and what was possible. He looked at the papers again. Looked at the safe. At Magnus. At the crowd that had been laughing at him and was now watching him with suspicion growing in their eyes. And made a choice that would change everything about what happened next. "All right," Silas said. He walked to Magnus, held out the papers. "You want these? Take them." Magnus's eyes widened slightly. His hand reached for the papers, and Silas let him take them. Then Silas turned to the crowd. "But everyone here saw what was in that safe. Everyone knows what those papers said, and everyone knows Magnus Hartwell lied about what he was risking." He pointed at the gold still visible inside the safe. "That gold is mine. The deal was clear. But the papers?" He looked at Magnus. "I'm giving those back, because I don't need them to prove what everyone already saw." The crowd was silent, processing, weighing what they'd witnessed. Magnus clutched the papers, but his face showed no relief, because Silas was right. The damage was done. The seed of doubt was planted, and no amount of papers disappearing would make people forget what they'd seen with their own eyes. "You think this is over?" Magnus's voice was low, dangerous. "No," Silas said. "I think it just started." The crowd didn't disperse. That was the first problem. They stood in loose clusters along the street, talking in voices that carried, pointing at the safe, at Magnus, at Silas, the kind of talk that spread like fire in dry brush. Magnus saw it happening. His face cycled through expressions too fast: rage, calculation, forced calm. He waved to his two men. They approached the safe, lifting it with visible effort. "Wait," Silas said. Magnus stopped, turned. "What now?" "The gold stays here until I count it." "You don't trust me?" Magnus's voice dripped with sarcasm. "No." The simple honesty of it made several people in the crowd laugh. Not loudly, but enough. Magnus's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "Fine." He gestured to his men. "Put it down." The safe thumped back into the dirt. Magnus pulled out a pocket watch, made a show of checking it. "You have 5 minutes. Then my men are taking my property back to the bank." "Your property?" The tall man from earlier stepped forward. "He won that fair. You made the challenge public." "The safe is mine," Magnus said coldly. "The contents were the wager, not the safe itself." "Then empty it," the man said. "Let him count what's his." Other voices joined in, agreement rippling through the onlookers. Magnus's expression darkened, but he was trapped by his own public spectacle. He nodded curtly to Silas. "Count fast." Silas knelt by the safe again, started removing gold coins, stacking them on a cloth someone had handed him. His hands moved methodically while his mind raced through what came next. The gold would save his ranch, clear his debt, give him breathing room. But Magnus wouldn't let this stand. Men like Magnus never did. 40 coins, 80, 120. The stacks grew. People watched in silence, broken only by the clink of gold on gold. "That's more than 500, a woman said. "That's nearly 5,000, another voice corrected. Magnus stood perfectly still. His men flanked him. The clerk from the bank had disappeared. Smart man. Silas reached the bottom of the safe. His fingers brushed against something that wasn't gold. Paper. But not the deeds Magnus had taken back. This was different. Smaller. Hidden beneath where the gold had been stacked. He pulled it out carefully. Unfolded it. Read 3 lines before his stomach dropped. It was a promissory note, made out to someone named Garrett, for work completed on behalf of Magnus Hartwell. Work that involved property boundaries being redrawn. Signatures being witnessed when no witness was present. Official seals being applied to documents that were never officially filed. Garrett. The name hit Silas like a fist. "What is that?" Magnus's voice had an edge of panic now. Silas folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket before Magnus could move. "Nothing that concerns you. Show me that paper." Magnus took a step forward. "No. I said show me." Magnus's hand went to his coat. The two men moved in. The crowd tensed. The tall man put his hand on something at his belt. Others shifted positions. The street that had been entertainment suddenly felt like it could break into violence. Silas stood slowly, faced Magnus with the gold at his feet and the paper in his pocket and 15 years of buried history threatening to surface. "You want this paper?" Silas asked quietly. "Come take it." Magnus stopped, weighed his options, looked at the crowd, at the witnesses, at how this would look if he attacked a man in broad daylight for winning a challenge Magnus himself had issued. "That paper is private property," Magnus said, trying a different angle. "It was in my safe. Therefore, it's mine." "The deal was everything in the safe," the tall man said. "You said it yourself. Open it, and what's inside is his." Magnus's face went red again. "That wasn't part of the wager." "Then you should have been more specific." The tall man looked at Silas. "What's the paper say?" Silas felt the weight of choice pressing down. Show the paper, and expose whatever Magnus had done with this Garrett person. Keep it hidden and use it as leverage later. Or burn it and walk away clean with just the gold. But Garrett, that name, that specific name, it's a receipt, Silas said carefully. For work done. Work that wasn't exactly legal. Magnus went very still. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about." Silas's voice stayed level, but something in it made Magnus's men exchange looks. "I know who Garrett is. I know what kind of work he did. And I know why you'd want to keep a record of it hidden under 5,000 in gold." The crowd sensed something bigger happening. The murmurs grew louder. Someone asked what Garrett had done. Another voice mentioned hearing that name before, in connection with some land dispute that had ended badly. Magnus's hand was definitely on something in his coat now. "Crow, we should discuss this privately. You wanted public. Here's public." Silas picked up the cloth with his gold, started loading it back into a bag someone offered. "I'm taking what I won, and I'm keeping that paper. If you have a problem with either, take it up with everyone who watched you make the deal. You're making an enemy," Magnus said quietly. "A dangerous one. I've had dangerous enemies before." Silas finished loading the gold, straightened up with the bag heavy in his hand. "They're why I left the railroad, why I came here looking for quiet. But quiet doesn't seem to be an option anymore." Magnus stepped closer, close enough that only Silas could hear the next words. "Garrett's dead. Has been for 3 years. That paper's worthless." Silas met his eyes. "Then why do you look so worried?" Because that was the thing Magnus couldn't hide. The fear underneath the anger. The knowledge that Silas had found something that connected Magnus to a dead man, and whatever that dead man had done for money. The crowd was getting restless, wanting answers. The tall man looked ready to demand them. Others were starting to ask questions louder. Magnus pulled back, gestured to his men. "Get the safe. We're done here." But they weren't done. Everyone in that street knew it. This was just the beginning of something that would play out in ways nobody could predict yet. Silas walked away with the gold heavy on his shoulder and a dead man's name burning in his pocket. Behind him, Magnus Hartwell watched with eyes that promised retribution. And all around them, witnesses committed the moment to memory. The day the richest man in town got beaten by someone he'd tried to humiliate. The kind of story that would be told for years, if any of them survived what came next. Silas made it 3 blocks before the shaking started. He ducked into an alley behind the general store, set the bag of gold down, and pressed his palms against the rough wood of the building. Breathed deep, tried to steady himself. Garrett. The name shouldn't have meant anything after 15 years. Should have been buried with everything else from that life. But there it was, written in ink on paper hidden in Magnus Hartwell's safe, connecting past to present in ways Silas had spent years trying to prevent. He pulled the paper out, read it again in the alley's shadow. Payment rendered to Mr. J. Garrett for services concerning property documentation and boundary verification in the amount of $200. Work completed to satisfaction. Discretion assured. The date was 4 years ago, a year before Garrett died, if Magnus was telling the truth about that. Silas remembered the first time he'd met Garrett. Railroad office in a town whose name he'd forgotten. Garrett had been young then, maybe 20, with quick hands and a quicker mind for understanding how locks worked, how safes were built, how security could be circumvented if you knew the right angles. The railroad had hired Silas to teach regional contractors how to install and maintain their safes. Garrett had been one of those contractors, smart enough to learn fast, stupid enough to think he could use what he learned for more than honest work. Silas had caught him trying to crack a payroll safe 6 months into the training. Should have turned him in immediately. Instead, he'd given Garrett a choice walk away from the railroad and never come back. or face prosecution. Garrett had chosen to walk, but not before telling Silas something that had stuck like a splinter. You think you're better than me because you work for the right side? We both know how to break these things. Only difference is the uniform you hide behind. 3 years later, Silas had stopped wearing that uniform, stopped working for the railroad, stopped pretending the splinter hadn't worked its way deeper with every lock he taught someone else to open. Because Garrett had been right about one thing. Knowledge was neutral. What mattered was what you did with it. And Silas had spent years watching people use what he taught them for things that made him sick. So he'd quit, bought land, became a rancher, buried his past under hard work and silence, and now that past was scratching its way back to the surface. Footsteps approached the alley. Silas folded the paper, tucked it away. The tall man from the street appeared at the alley's entrance. He stopped when he saw Silas. "Wanted to make sure you were all right," the man said. "Magnus doesn't take losing well. I noticed. Name's Raymond." He stepped into the alley, glanced at the bag of gold. "That's going to make you a target." "Already was." Raymond nodded slowly. "That paper you found." "Garrett. I knew him." Silas looked up sharply. "How?" "He did some work for my brother a few years back. Land survey. Turned out the survey was doctored. My brother lost half his property because the boundaries Garrett drew put it in someone else's claim." Raymond's jaw tightened. That someone else was Magnus Hartwell. The pieces started connecting. Garrett hadn't just walked away from the railroad. He'd taken what Silas taught him and hired himself out to men like Magnus, falsifying documents, redrawing boundaries, using his knowledge of how official seals and locks worked to make theft look legal. "How many properties?" Silas asked. "At least a dozen that I know of, maybe more." Raymond leaned against the alley wall. "Garrett died in an accident 3 years ago. Horse threw him, broke his neck. Convenient timing considering he'd just started talking about how some of his clients hadn't paid him what they promised. You think Magnus had him killed? I think Garrett knew too much and became a liability." Raymond looked at the bag again. "Like you are now." Silas picked up the gold, felt its weight. "I won this fair. Fair doesn't matter to men like Magnus. What matters is control. And you just showed an entire street that he doesn't have as much of it as everyone thought." Raymond pushed off the wall. "He'll come for you. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but he'll come. Let him." "You that confident?" "No." Silas adjusted the bag on his shoulder. "But I'm that tired of running." Raymond studied him. "The railroad, that's where you learned about safes. Among other things. Why'd you leave?" Silas started walking toward the alley's other end. Stopped. Turned back. "Because I realized I was teaching people a skill that could save lives or ruin them. And I couldn't control which one they chose. So I chose to stop teaching." "But you didn't stop knowing how." "No. That stays with you." Silas touched the paper in his pocket. "Like mistakes do." Raymond followed him out of the alley. They emerged onto a side street quieter than the main road. The afternoon sun was starting to angle lower. Long shadows stretched across the dirt. "Where will you go?" Raymond asked. "My ranch. It's half a day's ride. That's where Magnus will look first." "I know." Silas looked at the man who'd stood up for him in front of the crowd. "Why are you helping me?" Raymond was quiet for a moment. "Because Magnus took my brother's land using Garrett's lies. And when my brother tried to fight it, he ended up losing everything. His property, his savings, his will to keep trying." He met Silas's eyes. "My brother died last winter. Gave up, stopped eating, just faded. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, be careful." Raymond pointed toward the edge of town. "There's a stable 2 streets over. Owner's name is Dutch. Tell him I sent you. He'll get you a horse that can make the distance fast." Silas nodded, started walking, then stopped again. "Raymond, that paper. It proves Magnus hired Garrett, which means it proves a connection to fraud. In a court, maybe, if you live long enough to get to one." Raymond turned back toward the main street. "But courts need more than one piece of paper. They need witnesses willing to testify, evidence that hasn't been destroyed, time for truth to come out. And none of that matters if Magnus gets to me first." "Exactly." Raymond looked over his shoulder. "So ride fast, and sleep light, because whatever comes next started the moment you opened that safe." Silas watched Raymond disappear around a corner. Then he shifted the gold's weight and headed for the stable. Knowing every step away from town was a step closer to whatever Magnus Hartwell was already planning. And knowing that this time, he couldn't run far enough to escape it. Dutch's stable smelled like hay and leather and horse sweat. The old man looked up from oiling a saddle when Silas entered. His eyes went to the bag immediately. "Raymond sent me," Silas said. Dutch set down the oilcloth, stood slowly, favoring his left leg. "He did he? That must mean you're the one who opened Magnus's safe." Word travels fast. Word always does when someone makes a fool of Magnus Hartwell. Dutch walked to a stall in the back, pulled out a roan mare with good legs and clear eyes. "This one will get you where you're going, but she won't outrun bullets if it comes to that. I'm hoping it won't." Dutch snorted. Hope's a poor strategy against men like Magnus. He started saddling the horse with practiced efficiency. "Raymond told me about his brother, about Garrett, about all of it." Silas set the gold down. His shoulder ached from carrying it. "Did you know Garrett?" "Knew of him. Worked fast, charged less than honest surveyors, and somehow his numbers always favored whoever paid him most." Dutch tightened the cinch. "When he died, I figured it was justice catching up. Didn't realize it might have been Magnus tidying loose ends." "You think Magnus killed him?" "I think Magnus doesn't like witnesses." Dutch paused, looked at Silas directly. "Which makes you a problem he'll want solved permanent." Silas picked up the gold again, tied it to the saddle Dutch had prepared. The weight made the mare shift her stance. "How long before he comes after me?" "Already started, I'd wager. He's got men who do his dirty work. 3 of them usually. They'll ride out tonight, get to your ranch by morning if they push hard. Then I need to push harder. Or you need to not go to your ranch at all." Dutch handed Silas the reins. "Man in your position might consider heading north, losing himself in territory Magnus doesn't control. And lose everything I built? Better than losing your life." Dutch opened the stable door. Sunlight slanted through, painting everything gold. "But I'm guessing you're not the running type. Not anymore." Silas led the mare outside, mounted up. The gold pulled at the saddle but held secure. "I ran once. From the railroad. From what I'd taught people to do. Thought I could hide in quiet work and honest failure." He adjusted his hat. "All it did was delay this moment." Dutch leaned against the doorframe. "What moment?" "The one where I stopped pretending the past stays buried." Silas turned the horse toward the road out of town. "Magnus has that paper because Garrett gave it to him. Or Magnus took it when Garrett died. Either way, it's proof of fraud. Proof that can't be hidden now that witnesses saw it. Witnesses can be bought. Or scared. Not all of them." Silas thought about Raymond. About the crowd that had watched everything. About how quickly truth could spread when the right people decided to speak it. Magnus made this public. That was his mistake. His first mistake was underestimating you. No. Silas looked back at the old man. His first mistake was thinking he could control everything forever. I just showed him he can't. Dutch nodded slowly. "Good luck, son. You're going to need it." Silas rode out of town as the sun touched the horizon. The road stretched ahead, familiar and threatening at the same time. Every shadow could hide Magnus's men. Every sound could be horses catching up. But Silas didn't ride fast. Not yet. He let the mare set her own pace while his mind worked through what came next. The ranch was a half-day away. Magnus's men would expect him to go there, would be waiting, or would arrive close enough behind that escape became impossible. So the question wasn't whether they'd find him. The question was what condition they'd find him in, prepared or panicked, ready or running. Silas touched the paper in his pocket, felt the weight of Garrett's name connecting past to present, connecting Magnus's crimes to Silas's own history of teaching dangerous knowledge to dangerous people. Maybe Dutch was right. Maybe this was the moment he'd been delaying for 15 years. Not the moment when his past caught up to him. The moment when he finally stopped running from it. 3 miles outside town, Silas spotted riders coming from the east. 2 of them, moving fast. He tensed, hand going to the rifle secured on his saddle. But as they got closer, he recognized one of them. Raymond. They met where the road split toward Silas's ranch. Raymond's horse was lathered with sweat. The man riding with him looked younger, maybe 20, with Raymond's same sharp eyes. "This is my nephew Thomas," Raymond said. "Figured you could use company on the road. I work alone." "Not tonight you don't." Raymond's voice was firm. "Magnus sent 4 men after you. Not 3 like Dutch thought. 4. They left an hour ago, circled wide to get ahead of you." Silas felt his stomach drop. "They're already at my ranch, or waiting on the road before it." Raymond dismounted, pulled a rolled paper from his saddlebag, spread it on the ground. It was a rough map of the area. "We've got 2 choices. Push through and hope we're faster, Or take the canyon route, come at your ranch from the back. Canyon route adds 3 hours, but keeps us alive to arrive. Raymond tapped the map. Your call, but make it fast. They'll have scouts watching the main road. Silas looked at the map, at the 2 routes, at Raymond and Thomas waiting for his decision, at the gold tied to his saddle and the paper in his pocket, and 15 years of trying to escape a life that had finally caught up. Canyon, he said. If we're going to face them, we do it on ground we choose. Raymond rolled up the map. Smart, painful, but smart. They rode into the falling dark, leaving the main road behind. And behind them, 4 men hired by Magnus Hartwell closed in on an empty ranch, wondering where their target had gone. The canyon route was narrow and treacherous in the dark. Rock walls rose on both sides, blocking moonlight. The horses picked their way carefully over loose stone. One wrong step and they'd go down. Thomas rode at the back, watching their trail. Raymond led. Silas stayed in the middle with the gold. Nobody spoke for the first hour. The only sounds were hoofbeats and breathing and the occasional scrape of stone under hoof. Finally, Raymond broke the silence. Your ranch, what's there worth defending? Silas considered the question. Not much. Small house. A barn that needs repair. 20 head of cattle if I'm lucky. Then why go back at all? Because it's mine. The words came out harder than Silas intended. Because I bought it with honest work, and I'm tired of men like Magnus taking what doesn't belong to them. Raymond glanced back. Even if defending it gets you killed? Especially then. They rode in silence again. The canyon walls gradually widened. Stars appeared overhead, bright and cold. Thomas whistled low from behind. They stopped. Someone following? Silas asked quietly. Can't tell. Thought I heard something. Thomas stared back the way they'd come. Could be echo. Could be horses. Raymond dismounted, pressed his ear to the ground. Stayed still for 30 seconds. Stood up. Nothing. We're clear. But the moment had sharpened everyone's nerves. They rode faster now, pushing the horses harder than was wise in the dark. The canyon opened into scrubland. Another hour and they'd reach Silas's property from the backside. Tell me about Garrett, Raymond said suddenly. How you knew him? Silas had been expecting this question. I taught him. Railroad hired me to train regional contractors in security. Safe installation, lock mechanisms, how to protect payroll shipments. And he used that training to steal. He used it to serve people who wanted things that weren't theirs. Silas shifted in the saddle. I caught him trying to crack a payroll safe. Should have turned him in, gave him a second chance instead. That's not your fault, isn't it? Silas looked at Raymond. I taught him the skills. I let him walk away with knowledge that could break any lock west of the Mississippi. And then he sold those skills to your brother's enemies, to Magnus, to whoever paid enough. Raymond was quiet for a moment. My brother never blamed you. He blamed Garrett. And Magnus. Your brother didn't know about me. No. But I'm telling you now the guilt you're carrying isn't yours to carry. Raymond's voice was firm. Garrett made his choices. Magnus made his. You taught a skill. They chose to corrupt it. And now Garrett's dead because of those choices. Or because Magnus wanted him dead. Raymond pulled his horse to a stop. They'd reached a ridge overlooking dark land. Either way, you can't change what happened. You can only decide what happens next. Below them, maybe 2 miles distant, Silas could make out the dark shape of his ranch buildings. No lights, no movement. But that didn't mean Magnus's men weren't there. Thomas rode up beside them. What's the plan? We scout first, Raymond said. See where they position themselves. How many are actually there? Then we decide. Decide what? Silas asked. Whether we fight or negotiate. Raymond looked at him. You've got something Magnus wants. That paper. Maybe we use it. As what? Leverage? As trade. The paper for safe passage. He gets his evidence back. You get to keep breathing. Silas pulled out the paper. Looked at it in the starlight. Garrett's name. Magnus's payment. Proof of fraud that could unravel years of stolen land. And everyone Magnus robbed stays robbed, Silas said quietly. But you stay alive. To do what? Keep ranching on land I'll lose anyway when the next drought comes? Watch Magnus continue taking what he wants because nobody has proof anymore? Better than dying for principle. Is it? Silas folded the paper, put it back in his pocket. Raymond, your brother died because Magnus stole his land using Garrett's lies. You said he gave up, stopped fighting, faded. Raymond's jaw tightened. That's why I'm helping you. So you don't fade too. I'm not going to fade. I'm going to finish what I started when I opened that safe. Silas touched the paper in his pocket. This isn't about the ranch anymore. It's about stopping Magnus from doing to anyone else what he did to your brother. Noble words from a dead man. Maybe. But at least I'll die standing instead of running. Silas looked at Thomas. You didn't sign up for this. Neither of you did. If you want to leave, I understand. Thomas looked at his uncle. Raymond stared at Silas for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not with humor, with something grimmer. My brother was a good man, better than most, and Magnus Hartwell destroyed him for profit. Raymond checked his rifle. I'm not leaving. Neither am I, Thomas said. The three of them sat on their horses, looking down at the dark ranch where 4 armed men waited, where violence was coming whether they wanted it or not, where the choice wasn't between safety and danger anymore, just between different kinds of danger. All right, Silas said. Let's go see what we're up against. They rode down from the ridge, leaving the high ground behind, moving toward confrontation that had been building since the moment Magnus put that safe in the street and made the worst bet of his life. Behind them, the canyon trail remained empty, but not for long, because Magnus Hartwell hadn't sent just 4 men. He'd sent 6, and the last 2 were following the canyon route, closing the trap from both sides. Thomas heard them first, horses behind, moving fast through the canyon they'd just left. He whistled sharp and low. Silas turned in his saddle. How many? Raymond asked. 2. Thomas pointed back. The ones from the canyon route, which meant 4 more were still waiting at the ranch, 6 total, split to trap him from both directions. Magnus had planned this carefully, but careful plans required one thing Magnus hadn't counted on, Silas not following the expected path. We can't fight 6 men, Raymond said. Not in open country. Silas looked at the dark ranch buildings ahead, at the canyon behind where 2 riders pursued, at the scrubland offering no cover, then at the distant lights of town, 3 hours back the way they'd come. We're not going to fight them, Silas said. We're going back to town. Raymond stared. That's where Magnus is. Exactly. He sent all 6 men after me, which means he's sitting in his bank right now thinking he's won. Silas touched the paper in his pocket. He's alone, unprotected, and he doesn't expect me to come back. Because it's insane. It's the only move that makes sense. Silas kicked his horse into a gallop. The 4 at my ranch will figure out I'm not coming. By the time they ride back to report, this will already be over. They rode hard through darkness with 2 riders closing behind. The horses strained. The gold bounced against Silas's saddle, but they kept the gap, kept pushing toward town's distant lights. An hour passed. The pursuers stayed close but couldn't quite catch them. Another hour. Town grew from pinpricks to buildings. The 2 men behind them realized where Silas was heading and pushed harder, trying to cut him off before he reached witnesses. They burst onto Main Street with the riders 100 yards back. Doors opened. People emerged. By the time Silas reached the bank, a crowd was forming. He dismounted hard, pushed through the door. Magnus sat at his desk, papers spread before him, lamplight casting shadows across his face. He looked up, saw Silas, went pale. You're supposed to be dead. Your men are still waiting for me at my ranch. Silas pulled out the paper, held it high. So I came back to finish this where it started, in front of witnesses. Magnus stood, but the crowd was already pressing into the doorway. Raymond and Thomas flanked Silas. Dutch pushed through. The tall man, a dozen others who'd watched the safe challenge. The 2 riders who'd been chasing them arrived, saw the crowd, saw their employer exposed, and stopped. Everyone here saw what was in your safe, Silas said loud enough to reach the street. 5,000 instead of 500. Documents proving fraud. And this, he held up Garrett's paper. Payment to a dead man for falsifying land claims. Magnus's face went red. That paper proves nothing. It proves you hired Garrett. It proves connection to fraud. Silas stepped closer. How many properties did you steal? How many families lost everything because you paid a criminal to lie? The crowd's murmur grew dangerous. Someone shouted about the Henderson property. Another voice demanded answers about boundary disputes. Magnus looked at his 2 men in the doorway, but they were outnumbered 20 to 1, and they knew it. Violence here would only confirm guilt. You can't prove anything, Magnus tried. I don't have to. Silas gestured at the witnesses. They saw your safe. They saw you panic. They saw you lie about what was inside. That's enough to make people look closer at every property you've taken. Magnus's shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in recognition that the game had changed, that the public humiliation he'd inflicted on others had destroyed him. What do you want? My land, clear title, no debt. Silas folded the paper. And you return every property taken using Garrett's false documents, starting with Raymond's brother's land. That's non-negotiable. Silas's voice hardened. Or face investigation, face audits. Face everyone here demanding answers about every deal you've made. Outside, the sound of more horses arriving. The 4 men from the ranch, finally realizing Silas hadn't come. They pushed through the crowd, saw Magnus cornered, saw the witnesses, saw that violence now would only make everything worse. Magnus looked at his 6 men, at the crowd, at Silas holding proof that would unravel years of theft. He was trapped by his own arrogance, exposed in front of the same people he'd controlled through fear and money. All right, the words came out like poison. You'll get your land. I'll review the disputed properties. Not review. Return. Magnus's jaw clenched. Return. And the gold. Silas looked at the crowd. 5,000. I'm giving it to the people here. Split it among those you've squeezed with your loans and your fraud. Fair payment for what you've stolen. The crowd roared approval. Magnus's 6 men exchanged looks but did nothing. They'd been hired to kill in darkness, not face down an armed mob in lamplight. Magnus slumped into his chair, beaten not by violence but by exposure. When people stopped believing your authority, money couldn't buy it back. Silas walked out with Raymond and Thomas. The 6 hired men parted to let them through, their purpose dissolved by sunlight and witnesses. Behind them, the crowd surged forward to divide the gold while Magnus sat alone, stripped of the thing he'd valued most, control. 3 days later, Silas rode back to his ranch. The land was his, clear title signed under scrutiny of half the town. Magnus left for the east, reputation destroyed. Raymond's family land was returned. A dozen other properties followed. The town remembered the day a poor rancher exposed the richest man's crimes using nothing but a safe the man himself had put on display. And Silas, rebuilding his life, made peace with his past not by forgetting what he'd taught, but by remembering that knowledge could break locks, but people chose what to do after. The safe had been Magnus's arrogance made physical. Opening it had been justice delivered by the last person he'd thought capable. And that made it perfect, unexpected, permanent, and completely deserved. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.